Hi everyone, my name is Blessing Ochonogor. Just a quick introduction of myself. And first of all, I will say I'm very happy to be doing this with over 100 high institutions here in Nigeria, discussing and talking about SDG and as it relates to manufacturing. Like I said, my name is Blessing Ochonogor. I have expertise in food and quality safety management system. I'm a certified lead auditor for these management systems, and I am into full-time manufacturing as a quality and food safety professional with almost 10 years experience in the business. So today I'm here to share my expertise on responsible production and consumption. We focus on SDG 12.3. 12.3 talks about we cutting down the per capita loss in food across the food value chain. We believe that a lot of food is being lost from farm to fork. And then how do we become responsible enough to know that this shared natural resource can, go around by ensuring that we monitor, evaluate, and prevent losses along the food value chain. So today we are here to go on a pilgrimage on responsible production and consumption, not just for food, but every part of natural resources that we convert from raw material to finished product. So that's why we are here to take this journey on responsible production and consumption. The United Nations, in her wisdom, knows that the global hunger is on the increase as human population increases. So there needs to be a mitigation plan on how to ensure that these natural resources, which do not just refill or refill themselves, is being monitored, evaluated, and ensure that everybody comes to the point where we are not just producing, we are not just consuming, we are producing healthily, and we are ensuring that these resources are sustainable over time. We don't want to be those set of people who will produce and then the next generation have nothing to leverage on. So this is why we are here to take on this journey on responsible production and consumption. But I'll be a little bit focused on the responsible production and consumption for food because that's the industry I have a bigger expertise on. So let's go on this journey together. Problem statement. According to the United Nations Development Programme on Sustainable Goals, 22% of greenhouse emissions are generated from the food sector. This may be based on agricultural activities and other industrial practices, which is about converting raw materials to finished products. In the process of you converting raw materials to finished products, a lot of gases are being emitted as discharge into the environment. This in itself is a big threat to human existence because as much as these gases are being emitted, lives are being threatened. And then another problem statement to consider here is food loss. 1.3 billion tons of food has been discovered to be wasted yearly. Is that not a big problem in itself? Because the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations also aims at achieving zero hunger. But you cannot achieve zero hunger when you have a lot of post-harvest losses and losses along the food value chain. So what we are trying to say here is, how do we monitor, control, eliminate, or reduce the amount of losses we have during production? How do we reduce the amount of wastages that we generate even during the course of logistics, supply chain, and even at the consumer level? So this is what the United Nations is saying. We must find a way of reducing the per capita loss in food from start to finish, from the farm to the fork. That's what we're trying to solve here. And then 40% of the ocean is affected by pollution. While we are trying to keep up with food production, while we are trying to keep up with manufacturing, we tend to while we push for industrialization, we tend to cut down trees, we tend to increase our agricultural activities when it comes to fertilization, when it comes to other big activities we do just to sustain life. While we are doing that, we generate another problem to be solved, because water erosion, rainfall will always push down some of these chemicals we use for our industrial work into the water bodies. And remember that we have life underwater, which we call biodiversity, and this life underwater tends to keep balance in our ecosystem, and it serves as even food for we as humans. So when we continue to threaten this life underwater by excessive pollution, excessive fertilization, increasing the pH of these water bodies, it makes life underwater threatening. And it's even making some of the species that exist underwater to go extinct, So these are concerns to be addressed. Also, we say 80% of wastewater goes into water bodies without adequate treatment. In industrial activities, one of the big waste that is being generated is wastewater. Regardless of what you are producing, water is being used as part of its key ingredients, especially in the food industry. So what we are saying here is, while we are trying to produce, converting raw materials to finished products, as we generate those wastewater, it is expected of industries, organizations to carry out that civic responsibility of treating their water before discharging to the environment. This is not just threatening life underwater, it is also threatening the availability of sanitary water, the availability of clean water, because a whole lot of people survive based on the waters from water bodies like rivers, streams, and all that. So while you're doing your geological exploration, you are doing your oil and gas exploration, it is important that as you discharge your water into the environment, these water need to be treated, they need to be addressed, so that we are not just producing or consuming, we are responsible enough to say that life needs to be sustained all through. So these are some of the concerns, statements of problems that the United Nations Development Program have been able to identify. So now, what is, because when we say responsible production and consumption, you need to understand what is production in itself. You understand? So production is in simple terms, is we trying to convert raw materials to finished products that can be used, consumed, or utilized by the end user. Now, in production, the first thing to consider is the nature of the raw material to be used, because production is more of garbage in, garbage out. What you give into the system is what the system will give to you. So the nature of the raw material to be used is very key. The state of this raw materials, the conditions that they find themselves, the conditions of this raw material will determine the output. So if at that level of trying to purchase, we do not manage our raw materials based on storage conditions, based on recommended temperatures, based on trying to manage that supply chain, if we overstock, these could also lead to a high level of wastage even at the raw material level. So what the United Nations here is saying is that at the raw material level, we need to consider using this lean methodology called CiPOC, trying to manage the natural resource, the shared resources we have globally, from supplier to customer or consumer. So CiPOC means supplier, input, process, output, and customer. What we are trying to do here is to create a food loss or a material loss from supplier down to the customer. So we carry out an assessment. Where in this value chain are we losing food? Are we losing during our production process? Where are we losing? So at the raw material level, you need to also consider, am I overstocking? Am I not following the right recommended temperatures or storage conditions? If we are following and keeping to these conditions, then we now say, okay, we cannot plug it into the next stage, serving as input for our own process, right? So the input is taking in raw materials that meet a particular condition, that meets a particular requirement, to plug it into your system to to go through some level of procedures and processing to convert them just from raw material to finished product. So it's now the input, the way we plug in this input through procedures and processes that do matter. How do we manage it at that level? Do we follow the right procedures? Do you have the right competence to meet, these conditions to ensure that output meets the requirements of the customer? Because if you have incompetent people handling these raw materials, you also have wastage. So that production, the responsibility of production is also compromised. So you need to consider the competency of people involved. You need to consider, do you have the right procedures in place? Do they all know what they need to do? How to follow the right processes and procedures to convert these raw materials to the finished product? Do you have the system in place? Do you have the design? Is your facility designed to accommodate the the procedures you have laid down? Because if you do not have the facility, how do you adequately manage? Because sometimes the procedures are there, the competence is there, but the system, do not have the machinery to be able to effectively convert maximally your input to output. So this is something we also need to consider. And then the process is another thing to look into. Your design, your machines, your equipment, are they effective enough? Are they capable enough? After considering your process capability, are your equipment, the equipment capability is another thing to consider. Do your equipment meet the requirements not to generate as much wastage or losses as possible? Because we are saying here, we want to convert maximally input to output with minimal losses. We want to develop a lean system where products that are reaching the hands of the customer came with little of wastages along the value chain. So we are saying, yes, we want to produce, we want to manufacture, we want to meet the needs of our teeming customers or consumers. But while we are doing that, we also want to be responsible enough to know and to show that the next generation will not also lose, or even the generation we are in tend to have maximal, deliverables when it comes to the outputs, the final products. So while we are producing, we need to also consider, is our machines giving us what we need to do? And even if at all, for some reasons, our machines cannot perform optimally, we need to also take it a step further to be responsible enough to say, okay, how do I manage the loss at that point? Am I going to do CSR? Am I going to share it to my staff? What am I going to do to manage the losses such that we do not put them down the drain? Because aside the fact that effort, resources have been pumped into the production of products and services, you also need to look at the resources, the natural and shared resources of the human existence. We're looking at how do we manage it such that we still have enough to serve not just this generation, but the forthcoming generation. So you look at your machines, you look at your process, you look at your equipment. At this level, whatever goes wrong goes into your final product. So your final product is what gets into the hand of your customer. Now you have produced, you have met those set standards, you have met the requirements, you have adequately followed the procedures. But then, do you now have the right storage, right logistics, right distributors to be able to bear and carry on this your message and gospel of safe products to your end user? Because the way they manage it at that level will also determine if it becomes a waste or a loss at the end of the day. So we look at the output, the final product. Am I handling this product in such a way that when the end users get to receive them, they receive them holistically? This is a very big point to consider. So the output is not just there for their sake. You're not just there to produce, but you're also saying that, okay, I must manage and ensure that this output meets good set standards. They get to the customer or they get to the consumer at holistic as possible. So these are things to also consider while designing your CPOC flow. And then the final customer, the final consumer, because there's a difference between the two, you know. So the customer is the one who buys directly from the organization as a distributor. They exchange, you know, business for business. But the consumers are those who exchange money for the product, who consume the product, especially in the food industry. So when people pay for value for that product, do they have the right understanding of how it should be consumed? Do they buy more than expected? Yes, it's good. They buy much of your products. They purchase as much as possible so that you get rich. But they also need to be intimated on how to handle this product to reduce spoilage. Because sometimes, yes, we have post-harvest losses. Yes, we have losses along the production process. But at the consumer level, at the consumption level, we still have heavy losses. We still see people who discard food. We still see people who are not responsible enough to share to their nearest neighbors. We still see people who would prefer to throw their food into the trash rather than share. So you still need to give some level of insight, level of exposure to your customers on how they need to handle your product to reduce wastages, to reduce losses. You need to intimate them. If there are required storage conditions to ensure that these products are okay, you need to give them that knowledge. You need to share that information with them. And then you also need to look at how you tend to inform your consumers on how to consume your product as expected. So what manufacturing industry professionals do is that they inform their consumers via their labels. So on the labels you see, keep in a cool, dry environment, keep away from children, use it in this step, that step. So they give you the procedures on how to even consume that product in the best way possible. So this is one way to inform them. You can also inform consumers or customers via jingles, via social media, you know, via marketplace surveys, and then you go to trade and then you inform your consumers on how to best handle your product, because if they don't handle it well at that point, you're still going to have a lot of losses. What we are trying to preach here is how we reduce, we recycle, or we even reuse, you know, reuse material such that we don't have to go back. And so sometimes what is necessary for organizations is that even at the output level, you generate some level of waste that you can still plug back into your system. Okay, your customer generates some kind of wastages, they bring it back to you, and then you handle it in the best way possible. So you also need to look at, how do I manage every stage of the process? If at the output level I generate waste, can I still plug it back into my system such that I manage waste? So take, for example, you have a company that is into baking of sausages. At the output level, okay, there are some issues with the products. Can I still plug it back in? Can I create standard operating procedures to help me manage it even at the input level? Can I still plug it back into the system to minimize the waste? At the customer level, can I retrieve from the customer and still use it as an input for my process? So these are things to consider such that we can reduce waste at every point. And those that I know, okay, I cannot manage within my means, can I do CSR? Can I give it to my staff? You know, can I be generous enough to share with other people and other organizations? So having produced well, having converted raw materials to finished product, we will now look at mitigation. Implement a system where we have little or no losses. Yes, in production, there is a way we can produce with minimal losses. And the first thing to do is to, first of all, like I've said, conduct an assessment of your system. How do I reduce losses along my value chain? And then how am I objective about it? How do I set targets? Because what you cannot measure, you cannot control. And what you cannot control, you cannot improve. So how do I measure my losses along the line? What are the objective strategies I need to put in place to be able to measure and also improve that process where, okay, I lost 50% last year. Can I bring it down to 30? Because the entire goal of the United Nations is that per capita losses are reduced by half. So how do I objectively reduce my losses year in, year out by half? This is what we are trying to achieve here. And then we develop a metrics for measuring the carbon footprint of industries. We said already and established already that industries, tend to emit a very high GHG emissions. So we need to establish a metrics for measuring the carbon footprint of industries. Every industry should be responsible enough to measure their carbon footprint such that they can be able to improve. Like I said, you cannot improve what you do not measure. And then we implement environmentally friendly and conservative energy generations. If, for example, your main source of generating power for your plant is diesel, you can start thinking about tilting towards maybe liquefied gas. You can also look at solar. You can look at other alternatives that are more friendly, that have less emissions. These are ways organizations can contribute to responsible production and consumption. And then wastewater from industrial activities should be treated and recollected. As an organization, you need to be responsible enough to know that your waste is not meant to be dumped on others. You need to look at, okay, how do I recollect that waste? Yes, water is abundant. We have over 78% or over 70% of the world covered in water, but it's not for us to waste because the access to potable water is a very, very small fraction. So we're looking at, okay, how do we collect our wastewater, treat them, and then reuse where possible? This will help us to manage our shared natural resource, which is water. We need to manage that cycle. We need to manage that that practice. We need to manage, recollect, and treat where necessary, and then where possible, we recycle. If you have materials that are recycled, that's why some of these regulatory bodies are head-bent on pressing organizations to go to recyclable materials that are more biodegradable. So where possible, you reduce. You cut your waste by half, and then you use recyclable materials that are more friendly to the environment, and reuse where necessary. If there is a position or a way you can reuse. So for example, those that are into bottling, they use what we call returnable glasses, such that you use glass more than once. So this in itself helps us to manage waste, helps us to manage losses. If we can implement these mitigation plans, we can say that the world is ready for responsible production and consumption. Thank you for having me, and do have a wonderful time. Bye.